Hello, everyone. I'm enjoying Danya's chat here. Hey guys, pretending that it's fall by drinking tea, but still wearing shorts. The struggles. Um, yeah, it's actually getting a little bit cooler over here, which I am loving because I can wear nice jackets and not worry about getting too warm. So it's great. Awesome. Megan thought they weren't going to be able to make it, but has made it here after all. Great. Um, okay. This is my eternal strife. Hi. Hello, everyone. It's the big one. It's the plot embryo lesson. It's the finishing your plot embryo lesson. So I'm excited to get into this. We've got lots of good questions. I actually am feeling a little bit buzzed. I have a little bit of adrenaline going on, and I'm not sure why, but we're going to try and write it. So I'm going to start with our questions that were submitted in advance. But as always, if you have questions, if you have points for discussion about the content of this lesson, so completing the plot embryo, going much deeper into the plot points themselves, where previously we've been focused on the quadrants, then please post them in the chat now. Yeah. Oh, Megan says, very excited. This was an important Q&A to make it to. Awesome. Cool. So I am going to try and just like bring myself down to earth a little bit, but let's get into some questions. Oh, it's so good to see that you're all here. Okay. So my first, I should probably have had this open beforehand. Yes. So we had a bunch of different questions. One of them kept coming up over and over again. So I'm going to start with that and just try and answer all of those questions that were related together. And then we'll get into some other stuff. So the question that kept coming up from Amanda, Michaela, Samantha, Julianne was, how detailed does my plot embryo need to be? In one way or another, it was like, how do I know if it's too vague or too detailed? How granular do I need to get with this? And other questions to that effect. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this to start us off, and then we'll get into some more granular questions. I think also I want some ambience just for myself. So give me 1 second. Sorry, you guys aren't going to hear this, but it's just like a little bit strange that it's so silent. If you want to work, which I don't know if you do. The struggles. Okay. Sorry, folks, bear with me. Okay, I'm going to come back to that. Okay, so this question, how detailed do I need to be when I'm filling in my plot points? Or how detailed does my finished plot embryo need to be? Well, personally, I was thinking about this question, and I was trying to think, have I ever worked on a plot embryo and then been writing a story and come across an instance where I said to myself, or I thought to myself, this plot embryo is too detailed, or this plot embryo isn't detailed enough? And I was like, no, that's never happened to me. Now, obviously, that's inductive reasoning, so that doesn't mean that it's not possible to be too detailed or not detailed enough. Just that I don't think that it should be a huge source of worry, because no matter how detailed your plot embryo is, you are still going to have to create new material and potentially do more brainstorming while you write the story. That is inevitable. Like, a plot embryo is not the same as a story. Like, a plot embryo is your outline, and then you're going to have to build that out with more content. So either way, you're going to have to build out the rest of that content at some point. It's just a matter of when. Are you going to do it now while you're working on the plot embryo? Or are you going to wait and do it when you get to that part of the story, when you're writing it? So that's how I want you to see this distinction. So I have a little question to kind of keep in mind and to ask yourself in those instances where you might be thinking, I don't know if this is detailed enough. If I can get it to load, that would be great. It's not happening, is it? I just want some chill vibes in the background. You know? Let me try something else. Hold on. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay, back to this question. So you're going to have to figure out that content at some point anyway. So it's really just a matter of, do I want to figure this out now, or do I want to leave it till later? So if you come across a particular piece of your plot embryo and you're worried that it might be too vague, I just want you to ask yourself, do I want to figure this out now? Or do I want to figure it out later? Do I want to get more detailed now, or do I want to do that later? And a core kind of question here as well can be, will clarifying this affect the rest of this plot embryo? Like, will figuring out these details have to change other parts of the plot embryo? Because if the answer to that is yes, then you should do it now so that you can finish the plot embryo and you're not going to have to change things later. If the answer to that is no, if figuring this out or putting it into more detail or clarifying this particular aspect of the story isn't going to make you change other parts of the plot embryo, then whether you do it now or you do it later doesn't really matter, in my opinion. And so it's really up to you. And I do have an example for this as well. So in the Transformers story fix, which I have the plot embryo for here, this is funny actually, because if you have watched that video, you will know that Lindsay Ellis actually cameos in it. And so she cameos at the beginning. And as I was putting together this video, I basically sent her the finished version. And I was like, if you want to make any comments or annotations or anything like at the end of the video based on what I actually came up with, then let me know. Otherwise, we'll just move ahead. Or like, just let me know what you thought of the story fix. And she said, I thought it was great. I really liked it. The one thing I maybe would have wanted to clarify is that at plot point 5, I have RC, who is the main transformer in this version. I have RC become a prime. And she was like, I probably would have wanted to figure out how exactly that would work. But that's maybe just like a me problem kind of thing. So this is what it looks like in the plot embryo. It's just this last part here. RC becomes RC prime and now transforms into an awesome bike. And that was at plot point 5. And that was a very interesting moment to me because I was like, yeah, I guess actually in terms of like the world building of how Transformers become primes, which I think is something to do with the matrix of leadership. I'm not really big up on my Transformers lore, to be honest, guys. Is something that would have to be figured out if I was going to write that plot embryo. If I was going to turn that into a book or a movie or something, I would absolutely have to figure that out. How does she become a prime? You can't just have it happen out of nowhere. If we're going to keep the existing lore and world building mechanics of this story. And to me, I was like, yeah, that's fair. That is like, I wouldn't say it's a plot hole. It's just a space where nothing has been built yet. But if I was to write that story, of course I would build something there. And so I had left that ambiguous in the plot embryo because I was like, I can always, if I was going to write this, I would just stop and brainstorm and be like, okay, how does RC become a prime? How does that happen? Why does it happen? And so I would take something that is vague and kind of amorphous, and we don't really understand how or why it happens, or how it happens. We know why it happens. And then I would then go and do a granular brainstorm. And I have no issue calling that plot embryo finished, because to me, figuring out the specifics of how that would actually work would be part of writing that scene or those scenes, or even the scenes leading up to that. So that's one instance where I think vague or having things not worked out yet is fine. Because like I said, I was like, I don't think the mechanics of how she becomes a prime is really going to affect the rest of this plot embryo. Like I'm sure I can figure out a way that's not going to contradict anything else that I've got in there. So that's just a wee example. And I have one more point on that. Yes, but I'll come back to it because I want to catch up what you guys are responding to this. So, cool. Yeah, Amanda says that's a great magic question. So the last point I was going to say about this, like how granular, how detailed do we need to be? Oh, actually, I've just thought of another one as well. Okay, no, I'm going to go with the one that's just come to me so that I don't forget it. How detailed a plot embryo is can also vary plot embryo to plot embryo. It depends what type of story that you're writing and how, and maybe the medium and stuff and the format of it, and often the length as well. So I wonder if I have an example in my plot embryo folder here. Hold on. Do I thought that I might, but I don't know if I've got an example of a super simple one, to be honest. I guess I would just say that like there is a range of detail even across plot embryos, because every plot embryo is kind of unique. And so I do find that like doing like a story fix for a traditional kind of Hollywood movie like Transformers or something, the plot embryo tends to be simpler than like the plot embryos that I did for North of the End, for instance, which was a big, epic, complex story. And so they tended to be more detailed and have more stuff in each point. You might have a plot embryo, say for like a children's book or something, where you have literally one sentence in each plot point, and that's it. That can still be a really good plot embryo. That doesn't mean that it's bad or that it's incomplete. It just means that it's a simpler story. It's probably going to be told over a shorter span, whether that is a book or whatever it is. And so like the size and like depth and granularity of the plot embryo can to some extent reflect what kind of story it is that you're telling. It's just that like A4, this like A4 just piece of paper puts like an upper limit on how detailed you can get, because you still need to fit it into this space. So that's one thing I will say as well, is that different plot embryos can have different levels of detail versus vagueness and still be perfectly functional and super helpful. And then the last thing that I was going to say about that was that I think it was Julianne asked specifically, like, what do we do if we come up with some of those finer details or specific like details for specific scenes which don't fit into the plot embryo, but we want to use them? And my answer to that is, oh, laptop needs to go on charge, is that is exactly what the journal is for. If you are using the story toolkit, so the plot embryo is always designed to be that bird's eye view. And that's why we don't want to like blow it up and do it on big paper so that we can get super detailed and stuff, because we want to keep that level of zoom. But that doesn't mean that's the only level of zoom that we're going to need to use to actually write this story. And so anything that is like more detail on specific scenes that's not going to fit in your plot embryo, write it in your journal. That's another piece of canon meta text. So in the Story Toolkit workshop, there's a specific handout. I think it's called the Future Scenes Collection bonus PDF. The Future Scenes Collection is literally a collection in your journal for that information. And I have a way of like laying it out and linking it to the plot embryo so that you never lose anything. So if you come up with finer details while you're brainstorming your plot embryo, that you're like, this is a more zoomed in thing, and this doesn't really, like, I still want to use it, but it's not really that bird's eye view of the plot embryo, then add it to your journal. So okay, so that's everything that I had to say on detail and vagueness when it comes to the plot embryo. So hopefully that has helped. So I'm going to get into the next questions here. So I think just a super quick one from Amanda was, my protagonist joins a small group of people. Do I need to make a plot embryo for that group too? I think if I have it right from the protagonist video, I don't, if I'm focusing on my MC's journey. Yes, that is true. So basically this question of, is that group going to get a plot embryo and stuff, is going to be answered in lesson 10, which is the story solar system. So I'm going to give you all of the kind of like considerations and stuff that go into making that decision. For now, you're just focused on this one plot embryo. So let's get that done, and then we can figure out the rest when we get there. Yeah, just a super quick answer for that one, hopefully. So the next question is from Red, and I'm just going to summarize. Basically, Red's protagonist, where is this? Let me open it. Nope. Yes. Sorry, I should have had this page open, you guys. Just a bit of a mess today. So Red's question, Red basically has a protagonist who is an old man. So he has a lot of life to pick from in terms of backstory. And so we're talking about plot point 1. And Red was saying, okay, so I'm going to have this incident or this event which kind of crystallized his antithesis for him, which kind of like made him this way. Because he's older, should I have that event be early in his life, or should I make it more recent? Like, is there a benefit or downside either way to that. That was the gist of the question as I understood it. And to this, I would say, I don't think that how far in the past the events of the backstory are matters too much, as far as I can tell. The only difference that I can see really is that if you've got backstory that's like far, far in the past, many years ago, then you do have to think a little about what has his life been like for those years in between since then. If it's a lot more recent, then you don't really have to explain to yourself what he's been doing for the past 30 years, for instance. So that to me seems the immediate trade-off. Yes, and then there's another part to this question. Yeah, and Red was saying they're having a bit of trouble actually figuring out what that event is. Sorry, let me just put my phone on airplane. And I was going to say that if you're struggling with plot point 1 and you're struggling to figure out like what event might have led to them believing the antithesis, if you're kind of a bit blocked with that, then I would switch to the other side of the backstory and do a bit of work there and see if that makes the other side any clearer. Because there are these two elements to backstory. There's why do they believe the antithesis? What events caused that? And then there's why is the motive goal important to them? So what are the stakes for the story? What are they looking to win, or what are they risking, and what might they lose? So I would focus on that other side and ask yourself, like, why? So I think the protagonist's motive goal in Red's story at the moment is that he actually wants to die, and death doesn't want to let him. So I would brainstorm, why does he want to die? And why is that his most important goal right now? And through those answers, you'll start to come up with events in his life. So just switching to that other perspective might start to shake things loose in terms of the antithesis and stuff as well. Yeah, I think I managed a fairly concise answer to Red's question there, hopefully. So yes. This little curly bit just drives me crazy, you guys. So let's jump into the next question. Shall I take one from the chat and then move back? I think I might. Yes, because we've got 1, 2, 3 left. Okay. Into the chat here. So Dorothea asks, a plot point 4 question. Do you put in the scene in which the biggest ass kick happens, and when drafting, build it up to that scene? Yes, that's exactly right. Because plot point 4 is the majority of the story, a lot of things can happen in there. So you're going to have a lot of different scenes kind of chained together with lots of different stuff. And you can meander, to some extent. When I describe plot point 4 and that scene of like them fucking up somehow and their antithesis backfiring on them, that can happen several times over the course of plot point 4 in a bunch of different ways, or it can happen one big time, near the end of plot point 4. But it needs to at least happen once, if that makes sense. So how exactly you structure that is up to you. As long as you have at least one instance of that in that plot point, then you're good for the plot embryo stage of things. And of course, you can then break it down even further as you're actually drafting. But I would say yes, if you're going to Because I think, as we've already spoken about, plot point 4 can be this kind of chain of like smaller like successes and victories, successes and failures along this road to the motive goal. But it needs to be like, you can't have them start out with the biggest failure and then they get more and more successful and then they have plot point 5. It's you do want to be building up the other way, where it's like things are getting worse and worse because their antithesis is causing more and more trouble, and their reality is like coming up against it over and over, till the point where it's going to force something to change. Because if it starts tough and then it gets easier and easier, then why would we need a plot point 5 at all? If things are going well, then, and they don't need to actually change to actually get their motive goal, then we're not really working with that character arc kind of structure. I hope that makes sense. But yeah, it seems like you've got it right. Yes, and to come back to that, the question of detail versus vagueness, Caroline also says perhaps it's more if you're a plotter or a pantser. Pantsers like less detail, so there's more discovery. I, to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of there being this like what's the word? Distinction? No. Divergence? No. Dichotomy, that's the word. I'm not a fan of the dichotomy of pantser versus plotter. And I know that there are plantsers, but I just think that like this is a spectrum. And I just think that using those terms can be a little bit reductive. And so I will say that, yeah, there is a spectrum for how detailed you like things. Some writers may get by really well with more vague plot embryos, and some writers might do really, really well, like really hammering out a lot of the details in that plot embryo stage. You're only going to figure that out by doing it and trying it, though. And so all I can say in advice there is just do as many plot embryos as you can and actually get into writing them. And that is how you will figure out how much detail you like for your process. There's no way that I can give you, here is the correct amount of detail to go into, because it's really personal. But like I've said, I have never worked with a plot embryo where I've been like, oh shit, that plot embryo is wrong because it's not detailed enough, or that plot embryo is wrong because it's too detailed. I've never come across that, because there are times where I'm working with a plot embryo and I'm like, cool, don't know how that's going to play out. But that's part of writing the story, is that I'm like, cool, I know I'm going to have to brainstorm this scene or how this next part plays out, because that's the process of writing, my friend. Yeah. So the next question is from Bryn. So Bryn says, this is a really fascinating question. From my notes, it seems like because plot point 2 is the motive goal, it's exactly that, the motive goal, not an event. Since most other plot points are events, I just wanted to make sure that I'm doing that right. You had also said in the lesson that plot point 2 is kind of like the inciting incident, but to me that causes a little confusion and blurring of the lines with plot point 3. The character crossing over into the conflict zone feels more like an inciting incident, I guess. Maybe I'm way off base though. This is a great question, and I think is maybe a little bit of the trouble with calling plot point 2 the motive goal, because maybe that is me oversimplifying a little bit. I really like to call plot point 2 the quest, or like the arrival of the quest, because plot point 2 does contain the motive goal, but it's not just the motive goal. It still needs to be expressed as events that happen. ideally. It might be that you just have it written as a motive goal and then you brainstorm to figure out what those events actually are later on. But it is good practice to think of it as, how do I express this through events? Because otherwise the start of the story could just be you saying, Joe really wanted a red bike. And that's the entire plot point too, which you probably could make work, but I don't think is ideal. So a way to think about this is, I think of plot point 2 as the activation of the quest or the motive goal, however that happens. So this goal, it might be completely new to the character. They might have not ever considered having that goal or going after that thing before, or it might be really old. It might be something that's been on the back burner for them for a long time. But because we're telling this story now, this goal is suddenly going to go somewhere. So some kind of event or something that happens is going to push that to the forefront. Some kind of circumstances are going to arise where it's like, okay, suddenly I have to achieve this. And they're going to be actually motivated to pursue that. So I actually think that a kind of like video game analogy is kind of good here. If you think about like an RPG video game where you have literally a bunch of different quests to go on, you'll have like the main quest and then the side quests and stuff. Plot point 2 would be like the moment where you select that quest and activate it. And suddenly that's the path that you're on, if that makes sense. Yeah, I hope that answers the question, Bryn. But this is, yeah, it makes perfect sense, because I think sometimes linguistically I am a little bit imprecise about plot point 2, because it definitely needs to contain the motive goal in that you need to know what is the thing that they're going after, but that is distinct from what are the events which under which that goal takes shape, and how do we show that goal through events? Does that make sense? Cool. Interesting. So I'm going to jump back to Red's question here, just because she came back to me with some stuff. So Red said, the thing is, I have a vision of why he comes to his motive goal, and it's a series of events that build up throughout his life. But I wasn't sure if there should be one main event, or if I should just combine everything that happened and take that as the main reason of it just being too much. If you have a fairly clear idea of a series of events that, you know, build up through his life, which explains that, that's great. I think my tip of trying to focus on like one core event, which may be supported by others, is that it's very easy to just think of like, oh, well, their entire life has just been this, they've just been learning that over and over for the entire life. And that actually makes it very difficult to write, to actually translate that into text, I find. Because then you're like, okay, well, how do I describe that? And then you can end up just summarizing their entire life, which takes you kind of out of that ground level of the story. So if you can illustrate that with like one particular scene, which maybe isn't the only time something like that has happened, but is like the most important one, and then imply that, you know, maybe other things have happened as well, then that can work really well. If the backstory is like a series of those scenes or those incidents that all tie together, and you can see that as a finite thing, then that is perfect. That's perfect. That's great. And I would use that. Just as long as you know what those finite kind of moments are and you can actually write them, then that all sounds good to me. It's when everything becomes amorphous and you're like I have been in the past sometimes, where I'm like, well, everything in their life seemed to show that, because or it was like societal expectations, and so it can get hard to actually express or illustrate where that antithesis idea comes from, if it's a little bit too granular and smoky and far-reaching, if that makes sense. Okay. So Julianne has a very interesting question about the sage. So as we have spoken about in the lesson, the sage is a particular role that a character can play to the protagonist to help them realize the thesis and have their change of heart at plot point 5. And Julianne asks, is the role of the sage also possible with a group protagonist? Does the group remain as a team and carry the sage role together, or do I pick one character from the group protagonist who will play the sage? So I think there is like a little bit of muddying of the waters here, which I'm going to try and clear up. The sage cannot, it's absolutely possible to have a group protagonist go through their change of heart from interaction with a sage character. That's absolutely possible. The sage is not the protagonist themselves, and it can't be, because that is just the whole point of the sage, is that it's another person or entity that is providing them with some wisdom or something, or like exposing them to the antithesis. So the group can't be their own sage, if that makes sense, as a whole. If you want to try and pick one character from the group protagonist and make them the sage for the rest of the group, I think that could work. But then you do get into some semantics of like, well, is that character then part of the group protagonist? Because they're not going on that journey. They're kind of just acting as a helper to the rest of the group. But maybe that is just semantic. I don't know. Again, I always come back to the fucking Avengers for all of these group protagonist questions. But in Avengers Assemble, Agent Coulson kind of acts as a sage for the Avengers, I think, at points. That whole bit of like, we were going to need something to avenge, is kind of him acting as this catalyst for all of them to pull together. Maybe not in the traditional sense, but yeah. So I hope that answers the question. You can absolutely have a sage for a group protagonist, but they do need to be distinct from the group itself somehow. Because again, the whole point of the sage is that someone can't be their own sage. If they're their own sage, then they're just learning it through the events. And it's just your showing type of epiphany rather than your telling, if that makes sense. Cool. Okay. So let me just catch up on the chat and see if there are any questions that I've missed, or what question I'm going to go to next. So Katarina asked, so is knowing when the plot embryo was done enough up to you and changes? Yes, always. And again, like, sometimes I do feel a little bit bad that I can't give you something more concrete to say when the plot embryo was done. because I know that getting the answer of like, you will know, can be really frustrating. I know that that's not clear cut, and that if you're doing this for the first time and you're feeling some doubt about it and you've never done this before, then it can be frustrating to not just be like, Rachel, why can't you just tell me when it's done? But I cannot tell you when it's done, because you get to decide when it's done. And that is kind of the beauty of it, and also the issue of it. And this just comes back again to decision making and all the stuff that we've spoken about before, about not leaving the switch on maybe, and making a decision and deciding that's good enough for now, and it will be tested by putting it into action. So yeah, like when a plot embryo is done is up to you. What does that feel like? For me, there is this point where it just clicks. And it's basically always after I finish a particular brainstorm, and then that last, like I'll have brainstormed one section of the plot embryo, and then I'll switch back into intuitive building. And that intuitive building will just wrap everything up, because I now have everything I need. And so I'll just be like rubbing things out, rewriting them, adding the new information from the brainstorm. And it's just that new information has clicked into place. And now I actually have all the pieces I need. And so I will get to a point where I'm just like, it's done. It feels done. And I know that that can be difficult if you are being very critical of yourself, and if you are spending a lot of time worrying about if it is good enough. Because a plot embryo can be done, but if you are convinced that it's never going to be good enough, then it's never going to feel done. And so that is a bit of a mental battle that we do have to fight. But for me, there's this very clear kind of just click of it just feels finished, feels like everything works. And I don't have any issues that I need to fix anymore. And that to me is it done. Now, does that mean that you know that it's going to be an amazing story? No. Because the way that you're like, I've done everything I can do with this plot embryo. The way, if you're like, okay, the plot embryo is done, or I've done this version of it, but like, is it going to be good enough? Is it going to be a good story? Like, that question cannot be answered with a plot embryo. It can be functional. There are two things a plot embryo can be. It can either be functioning or not functioning, and it can be something that you like or something that you don't like. And those are the only two standards that you're trying to meet to finish a plot embryo. Does it function, and do you like it? Because if you're waiting to feel like, oh my God, this is amazing, this is transcendent, this is the best story, this is going to be the best story that anyone's ever written, you're never going to finish anything. Does it actually work to turn this into a story? That is something that you can only know by writing it and trying and turning it into a story. And I'm going through this right now with my novel. I had a finished plot embryo. I started writing it, and I got several scenes in, and I was like, this theme isn't really clicking. Or not that it's not clicking, but I now have learned a bunch of things which have shown me I actually want to just shift gears a tiny bit, just like not completely change what it's about, but just refine. And so I'm redoing that plot embryo, and then I'm going to get back to drafting. And that can happen as you're writing, but that doesn't mean that that first plot embryo wasn't super valuable and super useful. it's just decision making, it's just committing. Because you will only know if something was the right decision by putting that decision to the test, like putting it into action and seeing how it works out. You can never know that ahead of time. Like no one can see the future. So that's why I would always encourage you to like just ask yourself, like, is it functional? Do I like it? Okay, let's go. I might have repeated myself a little bit there. Okay. Cool. Kyla said, what about in the Brave story fix where Merida and Eleanor became each other's sage? Yes. This is about the sage. That's fine because they're not a group protagonist together. They are individual protagonists who get to act as a sage for each other. They're kind of going on parallel journeys instead of like the pair of them going on one journey together because they don't learn the same thing. At least that's the way that I broke it down in my head. I don't consider them to be a group protagonist. They're a pair of individual protagonists. Because they have different, even actually, I think their theses are actually quite similar, but they have different motive goals. And so then they can't be a group protagonist. Yes. Okay. So Danya asks, vocab question. The motive goal is what we, as the writer, know the MC wants or needs, not necessarily what the MC thinks they want or need. And their understanding of their goal can change throughout the story. Yes, that's exactly right. We already spoke about this in a previous Rachael study session, and I wish I could remember which one because I feel like I came up with a really helpful way of describing it. It was definitely one of the last couple. It was probably protagonism, right? Yeah. So I think, Daniel, you might have been there actually, but if not, I would definitely go back and check that one out because I think I described it as like the motive goal can have different layers. The need is, as you're saying, is the thesis and antithesis because they need to change. And then the want is kind of above that. And it might be that the protagonist only sees the want part, but there is always a need regardless of when they see it. And often at plot point 5, that's when they actually see all the way through to the need. So it doesn't change their motive goal. It's just that they actually understand the entire scope of their motive goal that had been powering them throughout all of this. Cool. Brad says, I just want to say I love the feeling it gave me when I watched things click with your story fixes. It was just, wow, I felt like I want to know how to do this. And I really look forward to the day where I have that feeling towards my own story. And Rachael said, yes, same, I second that statement. That makes me so happy. I'm so happy to hear that. I love those moments as well. And it's really fascinating to have filmed them because you do get this different perspective on your process. But like, I would actually like to almost like pinpoint like the timestamp of like the point where I figured it out. because like there's a point where you get that missing piece, and then it's only a matter of time of like shuffling the Tetris pieces and stuff. But like it's almost become inevitable once you've got that final piece, and things just kind of like either like snowball or it's like rolling down a hill or something. And so that last part tends to always just be me. Like it's usually just that fast forward of me scribbling and stuff because there's nothing to say. I'm just filling in what I already have. And then at the end, I'll be like, oh, it's done. That was it. That was the last piece. It's very satisfying. Mm. Katarina asked, plot point 5 and 6 seem to bleed into each other. Can you speak to this? I think bleed into each other. I think to some extent, all of the plot points can tend to bleed into each other. You might have scenes which seem to straddle two plot points, and that's okay. These are just guides to show you like what are the big tentpole things that need to happen to create a story with this structure. And so as long as you're actually covering all of the core elements that need to happen or that need to be there, it's okay if there's a little bit of bleed. Like I think there's some points where like I've been working on a plot embryo and like I'll have one description of like, you know, a sentence of a scene or something that I'm like, that could actually go, it's kind of a judgment call. It's like, does this go at the end of plot point 5 or the start of plot point 6? Now, for some pieces of meta text, that's going to be really clear. You're like, that's definitely a plot point 5. And sometimes it's not so clear. But if you know that it needs to be in there, then it doesn't really matter which one it actually gets categorized as. So, yeah, I hope that helps. Okay, let me come back here. So Megan Archambault, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, I believe is here. So Megan, if you're here, could you just let me know? You had a question about if you feel like you have enough or like too little or too much in each plot point. Could you let me know if I've answered that with the talk about vagueness versus detail, or if you would like me to answer this, if it's like actually a kind of different slant and you would like me to talk about that specifically. Because I'm just not entirely sure if I've answered that question already. So let me know. I think that's everything that was submitted in advance. Yes, so let's get into the chat. Okay. Amanda says, I love how the plot embryo leaves room for more brainstorming. Doesn't make you feel boxed in. And Rachel also said, I used to identify as a pantser, and I can say that the writing process was way easier with a plot embryo. I still got to do a ton of stuff off the cuff, but with an actual route. Yes, that's exactly why I love the plot embryo, but also why I think that, why I describe it as the plot embryo shows you where you're going, and the writing process is you getting to figure out how you want to get there. Because that's definitely how it feels, is that you have this like kind of bird's eye view of like roughly what's happening, but like you have a million opportunities to figure out how you want to do that and what's an interesting way to do that in the moment of writing that scene. And that freedom, that balance between structure and freedom, I think is just what it's all about. Yeah. Yeah, this is an interesting question. I think this is about, we were talking about plot point 2 and the quest and the motive goal. And Caroline said, I think they also may try to talk themselves out of going on the quest in plot point 2, but are then forced to go by the events in plot point 3. Is that right? And Katarina actually answered this with, I think it's a newer common choice, and in the Pixar memo, but you can also choose for the MC to answer the call without first refusing. But again, that's an older way, and the newer way is refuse the call first, then answer. Refusal of the call is a plot point in the monomyth, so the hero's journey. The plot embryo has 8 plot points. The hero's journey has 12. So the refusal of the call is very traditional. I don't think it's necessary. I think it makes sense for some kinds of stories, maybe more than others. And it's definitely a very traditional kind of trope to use. I don't think it's intrinsically necessary to do a good plot embryo. So I'd say that's really a judgment call. Although maybe one caveat to that is that the protagonist might be willing to go on the journey at plot point 2, to go on in search of this motive goal. But over plot points 3 and 4, you almost need to destroy the path behind them. Most of the time, I think, for a good story, is what you call the point of no return. So like they may have decided to go on this journey, but there is a point where they can't go back. Oh my God, you guys, I've got a good example for this. Here is a real life plot embryo. I don't know if you'll have seen this. Some of you who've been following me for a while might have, but a couple of years back actually now, for the last Preptober that I did a bunch of Instagram stories about this story of me and a spider. It really happened over the course of one day. The gist of it was I went out to collect some berries to have on my desk for my fancy bullet journal Preptober filming. And I was like, there's these orange berries that I know are out on the path. I'm going to go pick some. So picked some, put some in my bag. Also, my electricity was running out in the flat. So I'd taken the card with me and I was going to do that. But I got home. I think I forgot to do it, actually. So I got home with these berries in my bag. Now, I opened my bag, took the berries out. When I was picking the berries, I had noticed that there was a lot of spider webs all over the bush. Didn't really think anything else of it. And then when I went back to my open bag sitting in the kitchen, I looked into it and there was a big spider in there. And I do not like spiders. So it was haunting and scary. I was on my own in the flat. There was no one else to help me with it. And so I was like, okay, got to do something about this now. Had already taken the berries out and my bag was basically empty by then. And so I was like, I could just throw out my bag and just not deal with this. In that way, that would be great. And I'd basically almost decided to do that, which would have been like me versus a spider, right? This is the conflict. Spider is the antagonist. That would have been a way of escaping the story or the situation. But the situation did not let me, because as I was trying to see where the spider had gone, I realized that my electricity card to top up my electricity was still in my bag. And it had the electricity on it or something. And then as I was dealing with the spider, my electricity just went off. The lights went off. And I was like, cool, point of no return. I'm going to have to deal with this spider because I can't just throw out the bag and remove myself from this story. And it was funny because as soon as that happened, and I was like, oh, I need to go back into that bag because the electricity, and I can't get my work done today without electricity, it was like a switch flipped and I was like, cool, well, I just have to deal with this now and I have to overcome my fear. And I was forced to deal with it. Managed to finally get the spider out of the bag and it ran along the floor and I got it in a jar and stuff. And then managed to go and top up my electricity and balance was restored in the kingdom. But I think, so you can still have those moments which like close down the option for your character to run away from the story or run away from the change or the conflict and stuff, even if they do choose to go on the journey themselves. Cool. Daniel says this story is giving me war flashbacks of a giant centipede. Oh no. I've had some bug issues in the last few days and it's the worst. The stakes are way higher if they no longer have a choice. And it was really funny because like it was so clear in that moment where I realized that the card was in there that I was like, oh, there's no escaping actually having to face my fear and deal with this situation because there's no one else to help me. I can't do my work for the rest of the day. Like, that's it. I have to do this. And it was almost like that moment was crystallized where I was like, the only way I can summon the courage is because I was forced to, because there was no other option but to summon the courage to deal with it. It sounds very dramatic for dealing with a spider, you guys, but that's the example we have. There's something else I was going to say about that and I can't remember now. Nope, it's gone. Ah, well. Okay. Megan has come back to me here. Cool. So Megan says, that's answered some of it, but I'm still worried that I don't have enough for a full novel. Looking at my plot point 4, it feels kind of small. Is that where subplots would come in? I think plot point 5 might just happen too quickly. So here's the difference. Your plot point 4, I assume that you're saying plot point 4 feels kind of small because it feels like the events are kind of small. It's not that you've just got a small amount of text written into plot point 4. Because that is one distinction that I will make. You can have, a very short summary of plot point 4, which actually encapsulates like, a lot of things can happen in there. And so a small amount of text doesn't necessarily mean that the events feel small. But if you are saying that the events themselves feel small and doesn't feel like this is going to be long enough, first of all, I would say, it's okay to come up with a plot embryo and ask yourself what medium it works best in. It doesn't have to become a novel necessarily. If you are like, no, I want to write a novel and I want to make this plot embryo into a novel, then yeah, you can just flesh out plot point 4 even more. I would just do some more brainstorming. And I would what you're specifically looking for there is like, because like I've said, plot embryo 4 is like this chain of smaller conflicts, which all housed under this larger central conflict. So you can do a brainstorm of just like, what types of conflict, what individual smaller conflicts could the protagonist come up against in the conflict zone? That can be a really good way to do it. And then also, if it's feeling too small, like they're going to get to plot point 5 too quickly, it might be because the conflict isn't actually challenging enough. So if you feel like it's too easy for them to get to plot point 5, maybe think about, why is it too easy? How can I make it more difficult? How can I maybe amp up the conflict zone or the antagonist to make it really challenging? Yeah. Caroline says, do you run books you read through a plot embryo when you finish reading them? I have this urge to try that with everything I read now, but that may be overkill. I certainly don't do it with everything I read. I think doing a plot embryo analysis or using a plot embryo to analyze a piece of media can be super enlightening. I really enjoyed doing that with those 3 Rick and Morty videos that I did, where I basically just broke down a plot embryo for 3 different episodes. And I feel like I learned something new about the plot embryo every single time I did that. I actually have also been working on doing a plot embryo analysis of Kiki's Delivery Service, which is one of my favorite movies. And I just think it's always enlightening, but of course it is time consuming and it can be work intensive. So like I'd maybe focus it on, here's a good thing. What are sources of inspiration or influences that you want to draw on? They're really good fodder to do some analysis using a plot embryo, because it can help you see what parts you might want to steal and what parts you want to move away from. So it's really up to you. I mean, if you get a kick out of doing it, and you want to do it all the time, then it's your life. You can do that, absolutely. As far as like how useful it is for writing, I think that's like a judgment call of like, what do you consider to be an important text that you would like to do a close reading of, essentially. But yeah, using the plot embryo to analyze existing stories can be fascinating, especially because some of them fit the plot embryo perfectly, because they were probably written with like the hero's journey or a plot embryo like structure in mind. Some of them you'll find don't fit very well at all. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad stories. They can still be super enjoyable. It's just that that wasn't the structure that they were necessarily going for. And so it can be interesting to try and map a story onto a plot embryo, even if it doesn't fit particularly well, because the ways in which it doesn't fit can be very interesting. And might actually indicate ways that they're trying to subvert that structure and stuff. Yeah. Just reading a question from Dorothea here. Fascinating. I don't know if I have a very good answer to this question, Dorothea, but let's talk about it. So Dorothea asks, so for plot point 1, we're talking about how specific events cause the belief in the antithesis. So Dorothea says, this implies that it's a learned belief, but what if the belief is not learned, but inherited? So she says, how do novelists deal with inherited beliefs like outsiders are dangerous, assuming that it really is an inherited trait to fear outsiders? This is fascinating because I certainly don't have an answer even, to how all beliefs are formed. Because boy, that's a big mystery of the universe. You could, I guess that's kind of an ideological point, is that how do you want to do that with your story? Do you want to show a belief as being learned or imprinted through life experiences? Or do you want to make the statement that this is inherited, or this is intrinsic or biological some way? Because to do that, all you would do is just remove backstory altogether. I guess it's kind of the nature versus nurture problem. You could write a story with a belief, an antithesis that's entirely intrinsic, that can't be seen to have been caused by any life experience that the protagonist has had. And you can do that simply by writing a backstory that contradicts the antithesis, or by not having a backstory altogether. That would definitely be an interesting subversion of the plot embryo, I think, to work with. But this is a fascinating question. I'm very interested to hear what you guys think, because it's very philosophical in nature. And yeah, that is kind of like an assumption. Well, maybe that's an assumption that comes along with my particular lens on the plot embryo and that particular way of looking at backstory, is that beliefs are learned and imprinted through experience rather than just being us being born with them. Just to wrap up what I was saying to Megan about fleshing out plot point 4, Megan said, yeah, the events will pass too quickly, I guess. Not a lot of failures and tries. In that case, I would say you need to do a specific brainstorm on how the protagonist can fail there, how and why they could fail more frequently or more extremely in a bigger way. Because that is going to give you more bang for your buck at plot point 4. Cool. So Katerina had a question. If you're lifting heavily from your life, what pitfalls does one need to look out for? This is a great question. And I am, to be honest, still figuring it out for myself, because I have been working with semi-autobiographical kind of stories for a while, and I feel like I'm still learning. What I will say is actually a very interesting point that Maggie Stiefvater made, Stiefvater, don't know, at a seminar that she did that I went to, is that when you're drawing from your own life, you want to take the emotional truth, not the literal truth. I don't know if she actually phrased it in that way, but that actually seems like a really nice, concise way of saying it. So I'm going to use that. And I took that to mean kind of what we do, which is that your thesis and antithesis should be real and emotionally resonant to you. And they can be something that you've learned in a very profound way in your life. But you want to fictionalize the events and the stuff that goes along with it. So you want to take the emotional truth, but not the same details. So what would be a good example of this? So here's like a small example, I would say. For my current novel, I'm actually reworking the thesis antithesis, as I've said. The thesis antithesis are real beliefs and a real shift in mindset that I went through in my real life. So the antithesis is something that I used to believe about myself, which makes it very personal. But when I was looking at backstory, I could very easily have just given that character then my same backstory with a lot of the same details, same family setup, same blah, blah, blah. That to me is too close. That's like, you're just replicating things for the sake of it. What I prefer to do is, I'm still taking that same antithesis, but I'm like, how could she have come to believe that in a different set of circumstances to me that still kind of echoes the right emotional beats, if that makes sense? So like, she doesn't need to have grown up, in a single parent family with X number of siblings and this kind of situation. Because once you know what you need to explain emotionally, you can find other ways of expressing that with fictionalized elements, through fictionalized characters and events and stuff. So that's where I would say it's helpful to think of the difference between drawing on your own experience and coming up with new stuff, is that you want to, the why should be drawn from your own experience, but the what should be fictionalized or kind of remixed and stuff. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. Yeah, Katarina says, I'm using my same medical issue because I wanted to read a book with that in it. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I think it's just that you want to, I mean, this is also just like it is a preference thing. Some writers do like to write things which cleave very closely to their real lives. Other writers like to write things which feel completely different from their real lives. And so, yeah, it's really a judgment call. But that's like the kind of rule of thumb that I try to stick to. Okay, I think I might have covered everything, all the questions that I've seen. So I'm just going to double check. Awesome. Okay, so how are you guys getting on? I should have asked this earlier, but how are we getting on with the story work? I know this can feel like a bit of a big, scary one. In some ways, I do think it's actually good to just try and get it out the way as quickly as possible and not overthink it too much. That's something that I've been finding actually with like the story fix plot embryos, for instance, because I am filming and I need to get them done to finish the video. It forces me to make quick decisions, and it forces me to actually just move ahead with things and finish. When I'm not on a deadline and I'm just like chipping away at writing here and there, it's a lot easier to overthink things. So I don't know if I had a point with that, just that that's the case. I mean, I think that tends to be kind of the norm with creative stuff, is that a hard deadline can be very helpful to force you to follow through with things. Cool. Michaela says, good, almost done. Going to fidget a bit more and then call it a finished embryo. That's so exciting, especially because I know a little bit of the backstory of that plot embryo. And obviously, it's been on the back burner for so long. And it just, I still think about that story, Michaela. I think it's going to be such a banger. So I'm very excited to hear that you're making progress with it. Cool. Amanda says, after a few days after I posted my questions, I inked my plot embryo. I'm really proud of how it came out. That's amazing. Congratulations. Isn't it just so satisfying to ink up your plot embryo? It's just the best. It's one of the best feelings ever, I think. Caroline finished character today and has watched the lesson, and so is going to start building next. Awesome. That sounds really good. Exciting as well. I know that it can seem intimidating, especially when you're getting like such a big chunky lesson and stuff about it, but honestly doing a plot embryo can be so fun as well. So it can be fun and challenging at the same time. Cool. Sam said, once I started thinking about my antagonist, I had to go back and change my theme. So I'm reworking the protagonist plot embryo. Fair enough. Awesome. Danya says, definitely struggling to tell if I'm overthinking the plot embryo or if it's showing me the broken bits and I should be reworking them. but loving learning this process. That sounds great. I would say trust your gut. Most of the time, or even just doing a bit of a check-in on why you feel the way you do about a plot embryo, and asking yourself, like, do I feel this way because this needs more work? Or do I feel this way because I'm afraid to commit to it? Which is usually what's going on with me. Obviously, there can be different kinds of mental blocks, but sometimes just checking in with yourself and asking yourself that question can be enough to answer it. If you're really not sure, you can actually do brainstorms and other kinds of, you can do divination or journaling and stuff like that, to go deeper into what's going on mentally, to figure out, like, is this actually a problem that needs to be solved? Or is this me getting in my own way and being afraid to move forward, even though everything's fine? But I think it sounds like you're on the right track. Cool. Awesome. Red says, my plot point 1 is still empty, but otherwise it's kind of done, I think. I think that'll be interesting, because I think plot point 1 is so, I mean, they're all key plot points, but I'd be interested to hear if, once you do brainstorm for plot point 1 and come up with something, if that is going to, I think you'll probably find that you have additions to other plot points based on that, maybe, which can be cool. Katarina says, it was such a fast process. Usually I'm just stuck in the weeds. That's amazing. I'm so glad to hear that. It's so great when a plot embryo goes fast. It doesn't always happen. Like I said, they're all different. So if you feel like you're banging your head against the wall for a bit with this one, it doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. It doesn't mean that you are bad at this. It could just mean that this plot embryo is actually very difficult, because some of them are. The brave ones, you guys. I genuinely, for a while there, I did not think I was going to be able to do it. But what I've learned is you can always do it. Just sometimes it takes longer than others. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, Megan is just close, but working away, and might need to add more to plot point 4. Cool. Janice says, I think I'm pretty much done. Yes. Amazing. And Amy said, plot point 2 to 4 was easy for me, but then I got stuck on plot point 5 because I didn't know the details on plot point 1. Yeah, it's that symmetry just coming back, isn't it? Like, that is such a thing. 2 to 4, yeah, it does tend to be easier, obviously, because you're setting up the problem. The problem is is much easier to come up with than the solution. Does that make sense? Like, actually getting to solve the conflict is a whole other process than coming up with one. So that makes perfect sense. Okay, folks, I am exhausted now, but this has been excellent, as always. Such fascinating questions, and I look forward to continuing the discussion I was about to say in the Discord, but it's not the Discord anymore, in the community on the course site. We are going to have a thread where you can share your complete plot embryo if that's something you would like to do. No pressure. If you don't feel comfortable sharing it, if it's a little bit too personal or anything like that. But if you are happy for other students to see it, it's always super helpful to see other plot embryos that people do, and just see it in action, see how it works, and see the ways that other people do theirs. So there will be a thread to share your plot embryos once you get to that point. And as always, do remember that we have the previous Rachael study sessions from previous semesters that you can watch if you want to see more discussion on completing the plot embryo or on other topics and stuff. There's lots of, there's like a backlog of stuff that you can watch there as well. And I think that might be it. Oh, kind of off topic, but Katarina says, where can we buy your books? Just my website, rachelstephen.com, and there will be a section in the menu called fiction, and it's all there, baby. Yes, symmetry is so key. I fucking love symmetry in the plot embryo. It's just where everything like clicks into place, and it's so satisfying. I can't get enough. Cool. Okay. Thank you, everyone. As always, great discussion, great questions. I hope that was helpful, and I cannot wait to see your plot embryos. This is always such a fun part for me as well, if you're willing to share them, to watch how your stories like progress over the course of this. Because without fail, you guys always come up with some really good shit. So good luck with the rest of your story work. If you're still working on the plot embryo, keep at it. Be kind to yourself. Don't be too hard on yourself. And I hope that you come up with some good stuff that you're excited about. Yeah, but until next time, I will talk to you next week. And next week, we're going to be talking about tragedy, which is going to be great. Okay, good luck. Have a good week. Hope you're well. And take care.